I spent 43 years building a life in this house, and I never once thought I'd be the kind of woman who had to fight to be seen inside her own family. My name is Dorothy Hargrove, and I'm 67 years old. I was born and raised in Oakville, Ontario, just outside of Toronto, in a house that smelled like cedar and my mother's butter tarts every Sunday morning. I raised my son, Patrick, in that same kind of house, not the same building, but the same feeling. Warm, honest, straightforward. I thought those values would follow him wherever he went. I lost my husband, Raymond, 4 years ago this past November. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. People always say that kind of loss changes you, and they're right, but not always in the ways you'd expect. It didn't make me bitter. It made me quieter, more observant. Raymond used to joke that I noticed everything: the way a room smelled when someone was lying, the way a person's smile didn't quite reach their eyes. He called it my superpower. After he passed, I leaned into it more. When you lose the person who was your daily conversation, you start paying closer attention to everything else. Patrick met his wife, Dominique, about 2.5 years after his father died. She's a lovely woman on the surface, put together, professionally accomplished, speaks with the kind of confidence that fills a room. She works in finance and comes from a French-Canadian family originally from Quebec City, though they relocated to Vancouver when she was a teenager. Her parents, her aunt, and her younger brother still carry that distinct Quebecois identity with them like a badge. They speak French among themselves constantly, even in mixed company. I always assumed it was habit more than anything else. I was wrong. What I never told anyone, not Patrick, not Dominique, not even my closest friend Meredith, was that I speak French, not textbook French. Real, conversational, sometimes even colloquial French. I spent 2 years living in Montreal when I was in my late 20s, before I met Raymond, working as an administrator for a small architectural firm on Saint Laurent Boulevard. I fell in love with the city, with the language, with the rhythm of it. I took evening classes, made friends with Quebecois locals, sat in on conversations I had no business following until I could follow them perfectly. By the time I left Montreal and came back to Ontario, I was fluent. Not accent-free, but fully fluent. When Raymond and I got together and eventually married, I mentioned at once that I'd picked up quite a bit of French from my Montreal years. He was charming about it, said he'd married a woman of many talents, but it never came up much after that. We didn't have a lot of French speakers in our immediate circle, and over the years, my fluency sat quietly at the back of my mind, like a book you've read thoroughly but haven't picked up off the shelf in a long time. When I watched French films or caught French radio stations flipping through channels, it came back immediately. The language never left. I just stopped announcing it. When Patrick told me he was marrying Dominique, I was genuinely happy for him. He'd been alone long enough. He's a good man, thoughtful, patient, exactly the kind of son Raymond and I had hoped to raise. Dominique seemed to make him lighter somehow, and after watching him carry the weight of grief alongside me for those years, I wanted that for him more than anything. Her family was a different matter. Not hostile, at first. Just distant. The kind of polite that has a wall built right behind it. Her mother, Sylvie, was impeccably dressed every time I saw her, always arriving at gatherings like she was stepping into a photograph rather than a kitchen. Her father, Gérard, was quieter, watchful, with the sort of measured warmth that seemed conditional somehow, like it could be withdrawn if you said the wrong thing. Her aunt, Francine, was louder, opinionated, and made comments I was apparently not supposed to take literally, even though they landed squarely every time. At our first family dinner held at Patrick and Dominique's condo in Yaletown, about 6 months before the wedding, Sylvie looked around my son's home with an expression I recognized immediately. It wasn't admiration, it was assessment. She touched things lightly, the way someone does when they're deciding whether something meets their standards. She complimented the kitchen in a tone that somehow made it sound like she was forgiving it for something. I smiled and offered to help with the food. I am good in a kitchen. Raymond always said my roast chicken could make a man rethink his entire culinary history. Sylvie declined my offer so smoothly I almost didn't notice it happening. She and Francine moved around the kitchen together, speaking in rapid Québécois French, laughing at things I was expected not to understand. I understood every word, but I stayed quiet. Something told me that same instinct Raymond called my superpower, that there would be a time when my silence would matter more than anything I could say. So I kept my French tucked away, the same way I'd kept it for decades, and I watched. After the wedding, which was beautiful and genuinely joyful, I settled into my role as Patrick's mother and Dominique's mother-in-law with as much grace as I could manage. I made the 4-hour flight to Vancouver every few months. I brought food when I came. I asked about Dominique's work. I tried. The welcome I received was always perfectly adequate and never quite warm. Sylvie and Gerard lived 20 minutes from the young couple, which meant they were always present, always available, always the first call made in any situation. I understood logistically why that was. I didn't love how it felt. What I started to notice was something more deliberate. When Sylvie spoke to Dominique in front of me, she would shift into French. When Francine visited and I was there, the three of them would have conversations that excluded me entirely, not even pausing to translate or include. Gerard would sometimes look at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, like mild amusement mixed with something else. Patrick would notice and try to redirect, but Dominique always smoothed it over in a way that gently implied I was the one making things uncomfortable by existing. It wore on me. I want to be honest about that. I drove back to my hotel room more than once, with my jaw tight and my hands gripping the steering wheel in the rental car, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was being too sensitive, that grief had made me fragile in ways I hadn't fully accounted for. I talked myself out of my own perceptions repeatedly. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was last October. Dominique called me herself, which was unusual enough that I remember noting it. She said her mother was hosting a dinner party that Saturday, mostly business associates of Gérard's, and that they would love for me to attend since I happened to be visiting Vancouver that week already. She said it would mean a lot to the family to have me there. She used that word family. She made it sound like inclusion. I said yes. I drove to their home in West Vancouver, a beautiful house in the British properties, the kind that sits above the city with views of the water that take your breath away on a clear day. I wore a deep burgundy blazer I'd bought myself for my birthday in September, something Raymond would have said made me look like I owned whatever room I walked into. I needed to feel that way. There were 12 of us at the table. Gérard's business associates, a couple from Lyon, France, and their adult daughter, along with 2 other couples from Vancouver, filled most of the seats. Sylvie had prepared an extraordinary meal. Francine was there, positioned at the table like a co-host. I was placed at the far end, nearest the kitchen doorway, slightly apart from the main cluster of conversation, in a way that might have been accidental but felt deliberate. Within 20 minutes, I understood exactly why I had been invited. One of the couples from Lyon, lovely people, genuinely warm, had limited English. Their daughter spoke it fairly well, but the parents were more comfortable in French. When Gerard introduced me and mentioned I was Patrick's mother, the man from Lyon, whose name was Bernard, smiled politely and tried a few words of English before switching naturally to French. His wife, Colette, did the same. Gerard translated briefly for the table, then glanced at me with that expression again, the one I couldn't name, and said something in French to Sylvie that I absorbed entirely and completely. He said quietly, but not quietly enough, "Elle ne comprend rien. C'est parfait. Elle est là pour faire du chiffre." She doesn't understand anything. Perfect. She's there to make up the numbers. I did not move. I reached for my water glass very slowly, and I took a sip, and I set it back down, and I looked at the centerpiece on the table, white anemones and eucalyptus branches, and I breathed. Sylvie responded, her voice light, almost amused. Je lui ai dit que ça signifierait beaucoup pour la famille. Elle a cru chaque mot. I told her it would mean a lot to the family. She believed every word. Francine made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a murmur of agreement, then said something about the way I dressed, that the burgundy blazer was trying a little hard for a woman of my age, that Raymond must not have had good taste if this was what he'd chosen to spend his life with. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you say things when you genuinely believe no one in the room will understand you. I understood her. I sat with that for the rest of the first course. I sat with it through the soup, a beautiful French onion. I have to give Sylvie credit, and through the salad and into the main course, which was a slow braised duck that I could tell had taken real skill to prepare. Bernard and Colette were charming dinner companions. Their daughter, whose name was Elise, spoke to the table in both languages, bridging gaps. I responded to her in English. I asked about Lion. I asked about their business interests. Bernard brightened immediately and began explaining, in French, the details of a project they were working on, and Gerard started to translate for me with the patient, slightly patronizing air of a man performing a service he resents. I let him get about 2 sentences in. Then, I turned to Bernard directly, and I said, in French clear, warm, fully fluent, that Lyon was a city I had always admired from a distance, that I'd read about the Fête des Lumières for years and hoped someday to see it in person. I asked if he'd grown up near the old city or further east. The silence at the table was not dramatic. It was the quiet kind, the kind that happens when a room recalibrates. Bernard's face opened up completely. He responded immediately, delighted, reaching across the table to touch my arm the way French people do when they're genuinely pleased. Colette leaned forward. Elise's eyebrows went up, and she looked at me with a smile that said she understood exactly what had just happened. Gerard had stopped translating mid-sentence. He sat very still. Sylvie's expression, and I watched it carefully, because I had been watching this woman's expressions for 2 years, shifted through several things very quickly. Surprise first, then something calculating. Then, something I can only describe as the particular discomfort of someone realizing they have significantly misjudged the terrain. Francine said nothing. She picked up her fork. I kept talking to Bernard and Colette. We spoke about Montreal, about the differences between Quebecois and metropolitan French, about places I'd loved along Rue Saint-Denis, and the winters I'd spent learning to dress for a cold that felt personal rather than meteorological. They laughed. I laughed. It was the best conversation I'd had all evening and easily the most genuine. Patrick, sitting halfway down the table, caught my eye at some point during this. He looked confused for a moment, then something dawned on him, some realization assembling itself in real time, and he gave me a look I hadn't seen since he was a small boy, watching me handle something difficult with more composure than he'd expected. Dinner continued. The energy had shifted permanently. Sylvie served dessert, a proper tarte tatin, with the same immaculate presentation as everything else, but the easy confidence she'd carried all evening had acquired a crack in it that she couldn't quite repair. Gerard spoke less. Francine directed her conversation primarily toward the other Vancouver couples. Dominique, who had been quiet throughout much of the meal, found me in the kitchen doorway afterward when others were gathering coats and saying their farewells. She looked at me with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite guilt, not quite apology, something younger than both of those things. She said, "I didn't know you spoke French." I said, "No, not many people do." She held my gaze for a moment. "How much did you understand? From earlier?" I looked at her steadily. "Enough." She swallowed. She started to say something and stopped. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Dorothy. I should have things, shouldn't have been allowed to." She stopped again. I told her that I appreciated her saying that. I meant it. It takes a particular kind of character to apologize when you could just as easily pretend nothing happened, and in that moment I saw something in Dominique that I had perhaps not given enough credit to, a genuine conscience underneath the surface of someone who had allowed things to drift in a direction she hadn't fully examined. I didn't perform forgiveness. I didn't make a speech. I simply told her that all I had ever wanted, from the very beginning, was to be treated as a real person in their midst. Not a figure to be managed, not a number to fill a table, a mother, Patrick's mother, and that I had enough life behind me not to waste what remained of it in rooms where I was invisible on purpose. She nodded. She looked like she might cry. I said good night. In the car, driving back down from the British properties toward the city lights scattered below me and the dark flat line of the water beyond, I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt something more settled than that. Something quieter, like a door that had been slightly ajar for years had finally been gently pushed closed. In the weeks that followed, things shifted in ways I hadn't quite allowed myself to hope for. Patrick called me more. Dominique texted me directly for the first time, small things. A recipe question, a photograph of something she thought I'd find funny. Sylvie, when I next visited at Christmas, spoke to me differently. Still formal, still put together, but without the quiet dismissal underneath. She asked about my years in Montreal. I answered honestly. She listened. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was the beginning of something that could become warmth, and at 67, I know that beginnings are not nothing. Gerard shook my hand at the end of that Christmas visit with both of his hands, the way men of his generation do when they're communicating something they don't have language for. Francine gave me a tin of maple candies and said I seemed like a very surprising woman. I thanked her and meant it. I think about my mother sometimes and how she used to say that the most powerful thing a woman can carry is something no one knows she has. She was talking about faith, I think, when she said it, but I've come to believe it applies to many things. Languages, experiences, the long, accumulated knowledge of being human in a world that frequently underestimates you. You don't have to announce what you carry, but there is a moment, and you'll know it when it arrives, when setting it quietly on the table changes everything. I am still Dorothy Hargrove from Oakville, Ontario. I still make butter tarts on Sunday mornings, the same recipe my mother used. I still talk to Raymond sometimes, in the kitchen or in the garden, the way widows do when the habit of a person is stronger than their absence. I am still learning what the rest of my life looks like. But I am not invisible. I was never invisible. I simply waited for the right moment to make that unmistakably clear. If you are someone who has ever sat at a table where you were meant to be decoration, where your presence was calculated and your understanding assumed to be limited, I want you to know something. You are not obligated to correct that assumption immediately. You are not obligated to perform your value for people who have decided not to see it. But you are absolutely, entirely allowed to wait, to watch, to carry what you carry quietly and with dignity until the moment arrives when setting it on the table is the most powerful thing you can do. And when that moment comes, do not shrink from it. Do not apologize for it. Do not soften it for the comfort of people who were quite comfortable making you feel small. Speak, clearly, in whatever language you have. The people worth keeping in your life will hear you, and the ones who weren't truly seeing you before, they may just learn to look again.